Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to today's lesson, the first lesson on this particular channel. And as we begin the journey to understanding psychology and helping ourselves, whether you are a student of psychology, a psychology major program at the diploma or undergraduate level, or you are taking just some individual courses from the psychology, department of your institution. I just hope that the lessons here will help your understanding of some of the concepts and the key things in the program. And if you are just someone who is interested in understanding or learning about psychology, I hope that you find the lessons useful as well. I am Wisdom, the host and tutor on the channel, and I hope to be of help to you. If you want to know more about myself, I have a brief description under the About section. You can go through, but I am currently an MPhil clinical psychology student at the University of Ghana. I have a first degree in psychology with education, and I'm also an international junior research associate of the University of Sussex, UK. So let's go into today's lesson, and the objectives for the lesson are four. The objectives for the lesson are four. The first is to provide an overview of psychology, so define psychology and what it is, to outline the core goals of psychology, to discuss the practice of psychology as a science, and to discuss the various methods of acquiring knowledge and how these relate to the practice of psychology as a whole. Now, what is psychology? Generally, psychology has a long past but a short history, and this is a key phrase from Hermann Ebbinghaus. And this statement is very profound as it helps us to have an understanding of how psychology began having its roots in ancient, or very, very old areas of study, including philosophy and a bit of medicine and related, areas. And when we look at the history of psychology and the major schools over the period of its development in the next lesson, we'll go deeper into this statement. But generally, psychology is not so old as an area of study, a little over 100 years, but its beginning goes deep into the times of Aristotle, the philosopher, Socrates, and a number of other philosophers. By definition, psychology is the scientific study of mind and behavior. And this according to Kuhn 2001. So the scientific study of mind and behavior. And Myers also defines it as the science of behavior and mental processes. So three key things stand out in these definitions: the science, behavior, and mind. So science, behavior, and mind. These are the three core components of the definition. And we'll get to see why we say psychology is a science. And that would also defeat some of the myths or misconceptions people have about psychology and think that psychology is all about reading people's mind and all that. So when we talk about the mind, we are generally referring to that faculty of thinking that we have that consists of our conscious awareness of events, our thinking process, our perception, our expectations, our memory, and all of these. This is what we refer to as the mind. And it would also consist of our emotional experiences as well. So when we talk about the mind is a very powerful tool for the human person. And it's different from the brain. Some people confuse the two. The brain is a physical structure which consists of a lot of neurons and nerve connections here and there that facilitate various processes when it comes to our cognitive functioning and related activities that make us able to perform our daily functions. So the brain is a physical structure that helps the whole process of thinking and other related human uh, abilities. But the mind is referring to those processes of thinking, our memory, our expectations, our consciousness, and all that, our awareness, and all these intellectual and emotional, characteristics that cannot be seen, but that influence our actions. And behavior refers to our response to stimuli. Stimuli is the plural of stimulus, and a stimulus is any activity or event that causes you to act or react in a particular way. So these events can be, or stimuli can be internal. So sometimes the thinking process, what you are thinking of, could affect your behavior. And your emotions, so physiological response to stress, for instance, can lead you to run, or all those things influence our behavior. So our response to internal and external stimuli is referred to as behavior. And in some dimension, we can classify behavior as either overt or covert. And overt behavior is behavior that we can directly observe. So I can see you crying, I can see you talking, I can see you running, I can see you dancing, I can see you smiling, I can see you laughing. So those are overt, directly observable behavior. But the covert behavior is what we cannot see or directly observe. So we will need to infer that this is what the person is probably feeling. This is what the person is probably processing around the situation, based on some of the things that we can see. So maybe their facial expression or body language will give us an indication of what their response is to whatever situation is happening around them. So either overt behavior or covert behavior. And either ways, we are talking about your response to internal or external stimuli. What are the goals of psychology? There are four main goals of psychology, and the goals are generally to help us to understand behavior. So the goal of psychology generally is to help us to understand what causes behavior, why people behave in certain ways, what our thinking process is, how we process information in different situations. So generally that is the goal, to understand the mind and its processes as well as our behavior. And this general goal, is achieved through these four major sub goals. One is to identify or describe behavior. The first goal of the psychologist, or one of the main goals of psychology, is to identify and describe behavior. And the question that answers is, what is happening? So if there is a student who is not doing well in school, the first goal of psychology will be to ask the question, what is happening? So I want to find out what is happening. I want to be able to identify what is going on. So what is going on is that this child is not doing well in school. And, I'm able to describe why he or she is not doing well in school, or why we are saying he or she is not doing well in school. So the scores in exams or assessments, very poor, below average, and all that. So we will be able to describe what is happening. And that is one of the goals of psychology, to describe the behavior that we are interested in. The second goal is to explain behavior. So what is causing that child not to perform well in school? So that is the why the behavior is happening. So now you have moved from describing the behavior or identifying the behavior to providing reasons why that is happening. So the second goal answers the question why. So why is it happening? And that is one of the key goals of whatever psychologists do, whether through research or in practice, as therapists or counselors, to explain why someone is going through depression, why the person is suffering from some forms of anxiety, why the person is having difficulties with anger management, and all these. So, asking the question why is important to the work of psychology. So, why is the behavior happening? Then the next goal is to predict behavior. That is asking the question, when is it likely for this behavior to happen again? So, based on all the explanations that we have found, the causes we've been able to identify, the possible risks or predictive factors that are leading to that behavior. Now, can we tell what will happen if we do not, for instance, provide a child with an alternative, learning strategy, teach them some learning skills, or probably do something about it? So if we do not do it, what will happen? If we do it, what will happen? So if we provide intervention, what will be the outcome? If we don't provide the intervention, what will be the outcome? So being able to predict when the behavior will happen is the third goal of psychology. Prediction is important, and some people will think that psychologists read people's mind and then they are able to tell what you would do or what you were thinking to do and all that. It is through the interactions the psychologist is having with you, the observations they have made, and we'll talk about the scientific method soon. That gives them some bit of good information to make a good prediction about what is likely going to happen. So if they are speaking to the individual and you get to ask all the questions and try to understand why it is happening, what is happening, you may be able to tell, for instance, that maybe this client or this individual would likely commit suicide, because from your exploration you got to see that they've been having suicide ideations or suicidal thoughts, and they've had certain attempts of injuring themselves or killing themselves or something like that. So based on these information and your ability to conceptualize it well, you can make a prediction of what is likely going to happen if A or B is not put in place. And then the last goal of psychology is to control behavior. Now, with all this understanding of what is happening, why it is happening, and when it happens or is likely to happen, how can we manage the behavior? So whether you are coming from, so we discussed the schools of psychology, whether you are coming from the behaviorist perspective, you'd be thinking, how can I counter condition this particular behavior? How can I, teach this person some basic social skills and all that to help them overcome the challenge? If you are coming from a psychodynamic perspective, you want to look at how I can maybe deal with the issues of childhood um, problems or memories that may be affecting them now, and the dynamics of the family and all those things. So now you move to trying to manage the behavior or change the behavior or sustain the behavior, whichever way it is that you are addressing the particular behavior at hand. So these are the four main goals of psychology: to describe behavior, to explain behavior, to predict behavior, and to be able to control or manage behavior. So answering the questions what, why, when, and how. Now, psychology is considered as a science, not a natural science like there's physics and the biology and the chemistry and the rigid, approaches that are required in the natural sciences, in medicine and all that. But it is a social science. And it is a science because it follows what we call the scientific method in arriving at its findings and its interventions. And the whole move for addressing or practicing psychology from a scientific perspective, we'll talk about the characteristics of science and we'll see why that makes psychology a science. So the main figure called Wilhelm Wundt was the first to establish an experimental psychology lab in Germany in 1879. And his establishment of that experimental psychology lab paved way for looking at behavior, understanding mental processes and behavior from a very experimental perspective, where we address human behavior and the mental processes as scientists will do in collecting data, analyzing, and coming up with evidence to support whatever findings they have. So the over time, the discipline of psychology began to look at human behavior from a more empirical perspective, a more scientific perspective. And a lot of the philosophy was moving out, a lot of the, unsubstantiated or untestable, approaches to studying human mind and behavior were, left out. And this whole drive has made the discipline a very strong one when it comes to being able to explain what human phenomena or behavior is, and also provide some reasonable and workable interventions for correcting negative behaviors and also sustaining positive behaviors, and also helping with mental health related conditions, mental disorders, and how we can deal with them in a more sustainable manner. So though it may not follow the typical lab test approaches of the pure sciences like biology, physics, and chemistry, it takes a testable approach, a replicable approach, and we'll talk about that in detail soon, to understanding our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors, and how these interact for instance, determine our personality and related, functioning. And the science is characterized by some key elements, and generally what we refer to as the scientific method is a system of finding evidence to support a claim. And that evidence, you have data that is collected through a systematic process, and this whole process is supposed to be objective. So objectivity is one of the key characteristics of science and the scientific method. And it says that the scientist, and in our case the psychologist, the social scientist, is not supposed to allow his or her personal biases or values to shroud the evidence that is being gathered. So your data collection process and your interpretation of the data you have found or the information you have gathered should be devoid of your personal expectation of what you wanted to see or the outcome you wanted, or your personal values and biases should not shroud the evidence that you have gathered. So if you set out, and in the bit of research methods, we'll talk about a number of things, but if you set out to conduct your study to understand a phenomenon in a particular community, although you may have your own hypothesis, what we call the hypothesis, a tentative, statement you make on what you expect to happen, you do not let that shroud whatever evidence you end up gathering, whether or not it supports what you said earlier or not. So objectivity is very key in science as an approach to understanding human behavior, and psychology follows an objective approach. Replicability is about the ability of whatever you did, whatever procedures you use to collect your data or gather evidence to support your claim, another person, another psychologist, another researcher should be able to follow a similar procedure. So your procedure should be as clear as possible so that others can replicate, do what you did again, and then see whether we can come to a similar conclusion or arrive at similar or the same results. So replicability is the ability or the potential to replicate, to redo, to carry out again the same thing that you did to see whether we'll come to the same result. Verifiability is that the data, the evidence you said you have provided to your claim should be something that we can test, we can verify, so to speak, that it is true, that it is data that you actually collected, and it is something that is not forged. So we can verify the evidence, and this verification is usually done through the replication process. And the next characteristic is quantifiability. So we should be able to quantify the behavior. And this is one of the key things that psychology, especially the behaviorism movement, was able to emphasize, such that we can quantify behavior. It's not subjective. We can find a way of describing behavior, explaining behavior in more specific terms. So not necessarily always in a quantitative manner. So if you are using a quantitative research approach, even with the qualitative research approach, they are able to come up with themes that highlight whatever findings were there, and also percentages of how many participants said this and that, how many people. So 60% of the population of young girls, so and so have been found that they have issues with self-esteem and all that. So we should be able to find some way of measuring the behavior or phenomenon that you said you have researched into and found evidence for. Quantifiability is very important. The next one is reliability. And reliability is the consistency of your measures. So if you went about collecting data or information empirically to support a claim that you are making, that individuals that are maybe extroverted are likely to succeed in a particular career area, what tool did you use to measure and come up with that evidence? Is the tool reliable? Is it a good model that we can trust because it is consistent? So if it's used on a different set of extroverted individuals, will we get similar results and all that? So the consistency of the measures and the outcomes that you get using those measures or approaches is what we refer to as reliability. And validity is related to so if you carry out a research as a psychologist or as a scientist, and at the end of the day, whatever procedures you used do not reflect the output, or probably the instruments, the procedures you used are not measuring exactly what you said you are going to measure. So if at the end of the day, what you were trying to do was to test for the levels of depression amongst a population or a group of individuals, and whatever tools you used went on to measure their anxiety levels or their stress levels, these are different constructs, although there may be similarities here and there. So although you may have gotten an evidence in a way, that evidence is not valid because you were not able to measure or get the construct that you thought you were going to measure. So the validity of your instruments and the outcome is very important. And the last one we talk about is falsifiability. In other areas of non-science, you don't need to present yourself for scrutiny, so to speak. So falsifiability is about the capacity to make whatever evidence you have provided false, so we can disprove it. So in science, in the scientific method, whatever evidence you provide can be falsified, and usually through the replication and quantifiability, verifiability, and all other procedures that may be used in assessing a theory that you have come up. For instance, we can't be able to prove it to be either false or true. So falsifiability is one of the characteristics of science. It lends itself to being disproved. And over the years in the practice of psychology, a good number of theories and practices have been disproved and either modified or taken out completely. So these are some characteristics of science and the scientific method, and we see psychology, as a practice following these characteristics as outlined. Okay, I hope we are good. The next thing we look at is what psychology is not. So if we have identified that psychology is a science, and we have looked at some bits or some characteristics of science and the scientific method, and how psychology lays itself or lends itself to these. What psychology is not? What is psychology not? The first thing we talk about is pseudopsychology, which is the study of human behavior that looks as though it is psychology, but it is not. And it is not because it lacks empirical support or evidence. It doesn't lend itself to some of the things we have discussed here: falsifiability, objectivity, replicability, verifiability. Pseudo-psychology is more subjective, and it is not supported by empirically arrived conclusions. So it's not it doesn't hold much strength when it is tested via the scientific approach. And it's called pseudo. Pseudo means false or fake. So this is pseudo psychology, fake or false psychology. It looks like, but it is not it. And examples include phrenology, palmistry, graphology, and quite a number of them. So phrenology is the study of the human skull. So the nature and structure of your skull, the contours and all that is used to determine your personality and some key traits, as well as make predictions about your future. So they'll examine your skull and then use that to make predictions about your character or personality and then future. Then we have palmistry. They study the hand and then the lines in the shapes and all that, and then they can use that to make predictions about your personality, your interests, and your future. What's possible, maybe career area that you do well in and all that. And that is not psychology. It does not stand the test of the scientific method. So there may be people practicing pseudo-psychology. They are in their own rights, but what we are saying is that that is not psychology. So if you had any conception that, misconception that all that is psychology, it is not. Phrenology, palmistry, graphology. Graphology is the study of handwritings, and then they use your handwriting to determine your personality and some other key traits, and also make predictions about your future and all. So that is not psychology. That is not psychology. The next one is parapsychology, and para means beyond. So the study of supernatural or supernormal abilities or phenomena, and usually these are in the realms of religion, and philosophical thoughts, and they are looking at what is called the psychic ability. So they are not things that we can humanly, within practical evidence of data collection and experiments, we can't be able to prove or disprove. So it is para because its focus goes beyond the scope of our practice as psychologists who use the scientific method in our approach. And examples include what is called clairvoyance, and clairvoyance uh, is that ability to see beyond. So to see beyond, and they have probably dreams and visions and see things. So to see things, we can't verify that you actually saw beyond or you didn't see beyond. And we have telepathy, which is the communication between two individuals or without our normal channels of communication, our senses of communication. So you have in this image here, so can be looking at each other and then without talking, and we talk to communicate or do some language, sign language, or body movements and all that, but it's just about looking at each other in the eye, and then there's a communication happening from the mind to another mind. So whatever it is, we cannot prove that indeed there was a communication happening, telepathy going on, where there's no proper normal communication channel being used. It is just a mental transfer, uh, as it were. Then telekinesis. So I'm sure you've watched movies where there's an individual who looks at a certain object and it is rising, and they are able to control inanimate objects, just by looking at it, and then so it's what is called telekinesis or psychokinesis. They are out of body experiences where the individual feels they traveled somewhere, they left their body and all that. Those are more religious in nature, and they do not lend themselves to the scientific approach of verifying and replicating experiences. Once again, we are not saying that they are not true. We are just saying that it is not psychology, because it does not lend itself to empirical ways of supporting the evidence or disproving the evidence. Now let's end today's lesson with the methods of knowing. So how do we come to know the truth? And with all these other things of parapsychology and pseudopsychology, there are a number of ways that we get to know, we acquire knowledge, or what would say come to know the truth. So it's the philosophical question of what is truth and how do you find it. And one of the main methods of knowing, which is common with our human experience, is our intuition. So an intuition is our tendency or human tendency to follow what we feel about the situation or information. So I feel, so that gut feeling or that instinct that we have, in a moment, we take a decision based on our instinct to either take an action or not take an action, to do A or B, So that's that bit of us, that intuitive nature of us, is one way that we get to know, we get to find truth. And it's more of an emotional and experiential approach to making decisions. You don't really think through, do any analytic process to decide or make a decision. It is really about what you feel should be done. It's a feeling that we have, that gut feeling, that moves us to take an action. And so you can remember probably the times where you had to make a decision and you just relied on your instinct, relied on your gut feeling. I have a feeling that this method would work. I have a feeling that I have to live today. That bit of us is intuition, and it's one way we get to know. And it has its limitations, because it's not all the time that our intuition is right. Intuitive decisions that we take sometimes may be the worst that we have taken. So it has its own limits, and all the methods of knowing have their individual limitations, although they are popular ways that we get to decide on what is true and what is not. The second method of knowing over the years, especially in the realm of philosophy, is rationalism. And it's all about logic and critical thinking or reasoning, and using that to acquire new knowledge on what is true and what is not. And rationalism, so rational thinking, rationalizing the process. So it involves you establish a premise. So if A has happened and B has also happened, and both are related to each other, then in this occasion, I expect that this will happen. So that way of thinking. So in this first instance, I failed. In the second instance, I failed. So chances are that I'll fail in the next exam. So that way of thinking or processing information is rationalism, the use of logic to come to conclusions. And in philosophy and critical thinking, you have some modus ponens, modus tollens, and other ways of drawing conclusions. So, for instance, if someone says that individuals who are extroverted, as we mentioned earlier, would succeed in engineering programs. Individuals who are extroverted will succeed in engineering programs. And then the next premise is that Joyce, lives, Joyce is an extroverted person. So if Joyce is an extroverted person, and the first premise is saying that individuals who are extroverted will do well in engineering, then the conclusion, the logical conclusion will be that Joyce will do well in engineering. So that's how sometimes we are able to come to conclusions or come to a knowledge on what is right and what is wrong. And the challenge with this method is that if the premises you have set is wrong, then your conclusion too may end up being wrong. So although logically valid, it may not be true. And this is something that happens usually when you are dealing with individuals who have irrational thoughts, or they have problems with how they assess information or process information. So in rational emotive behavior therapy and other cognitive behavior therapy approaches, one of the key things is to help them to assess the evidence for whatever conclusions they are drawing. So if someone says, I'll fail because I have failed in the first year, I failed in the second year, you want to challenge that assumption, that conclusion, by assessing the evidence. And once you take them through assessing what evidence they have, and whether that evidence is truly reflective of the fact that they would likely fail. When you take them through that, then you reorient them, to think in a more, healthy manner. But we all go through some of these logical processes to arrive at conclusions, and it has its own limitations. Then the third method of knowing is authority. If a known figure or individual has said it, then it must be true. And a lot of things that we know as individuals, right from childhood, were based on authority. So from school, the things we were taught, we took it to be true. From our religious background, the things we were introduced to and taught, we took it to be true because there's an authority behind what is being said. There's a higher figure. There's an individual that we believe knows better. So some authority sources include religious leaders, political leaders, parents, teachers, doctors. So individuals that have a certain level of authority, or we expect to know more better than us. And authority may be a good way of acquiring knowledge. A lot of the things we know are based on the fact that probably Sigmund Freud said this, J.B. Watson said this. A lot of them are based on the knowledge we have received from sources of authority through our education, the things that our lecturers teach us, the teachers teach us, and all that. The values we are instilled with from home, they are mostly from authority figures. The sources or the books we read, all of these are authority sources of acquiring knowledge. And though that is a good way of acquiring knowledge, it also has its own limitations, because there's a possibility that our authority source or figure may be wrong. And this has led to a lot of damaging consequences in individuals and community lives, where there's a figure who comes up with an idea and says that this is the right idea, and plunges individuals into a lot of distraction. There have been wars that have happened because there was a source of authority that the people thought or believed was true, and so followed him wrongly or her wrongly and ended up damaging themselves and others. And there are times where we have relied on either religious or political leaders, and we've made certain decisions that have affected us. So there are chances of the source of authority being untrue or being manipulative in whatever knowledge we believe they are giving out. And then the next one is empiricism. Empiricism is usually associated with the whole concept of whether or not we had the ability to think and process information before being born, or we came with just an empty slate, nothing. What John Locke and others would call the tabula rasa. So John Locke is attributed with that phrase tabula rasa, that we are born as tabula rasa, meaning blank slate. So we come empty-headed, come with no abilities or thinking abilities, and then as we experience our world through our senses, as we hear, as we see, as we touch and all that, then the slate is being written on. So we are born as tabula rasa, and our experience, which can be verified, so taste, we can also taste it and say that this is what it is. What we can feel, we can see, we can hear. These senses help us to fill the blank slate, and that is what empiricism is about. And one of the schools of psychology that lends itself to a lot of empiricism is the behaviorist movement. And I mentioned earlier that their whole drive of what can be observed, what can be tested, experimented, controlled in a controlled manner is very key to the practice of psychology as a science. And empiricism is a component of the scientific method where we are talking about empirical evidence. We should be able to gather data. We should be able to measure quantifiability, and all that is as a result of the empiricism or empirical way of knowing. But empiricism is sometimes too extreme, because we can't always experience things before we say they are true. There are instances where you cannot see, you cannot hear, you may not have experienced it yourself. We cannot use our senses to provide evidence, but whatever experience is happening could be true. So if you are dealing with someone who says, I am feeling sad and I feel this and that, you may not necessarily get evidence from them that they are indeed feeling this or experiencing this. So, but that doesn't mean that they are not indeed feeling it. So the whole bit of empiricism is sometimes stretched, and it has its own limitations. So we say that experience is the best teacher. Is it always true? And why is that true? Is experience always the best teacher? Don't we know certain things without being taught? So that is one of the main philosophical arguments between those who think that we came as tabula rasa, empty slate, and those who think that we already have a capacity to think and make decisions. So empiricism is about evidence from the senses. So once we can see it, once we can feel it, once we can hear it, once we can touch it, then it means that it is true. So we can taste it, it is true. We can hear it, it is true. We can see it, it is true. We can touch it, it is true. But that is not always the case. The last method we talk about is the scientific method, and we've discussed the characteristics of the scientific method. And it's by far the most authentic way of knowing, because we are able to provide evidence and empirical evidence, which is one of the ideas of empiricism. And we go through a systematic process of investigating that phenomenon or behavior. It also has its own limitations, as I mentioned when we're discussing the para and pseudo psychology, because there are certain phenomena that goes beyond gathering data and finding evidence to support it within our human, abilities or capacities. So there may be limitations. There are certain things that you can't do experiments to be able to provide evidence for. But generally, the scientific method is helpful because it's not really about the the rigid science of biology and all that, but the steps that you go through to arrive at the conclusion. And there are five main steps in the scientific method. In your reading, you may find that it is seven or something, but basically the same. Some may split some of the points here. So the first step in the scientific method is to identify a problem. So identify a problem, and that goes back to the first goal we mentioned. What is happening? So your ability to identify and describe a situation is very important. So once we identify that this is a phenomenon, this is a problem, going back to the example I was giving for a student who is not doing well in school. So you've identified that problem or that situation. Now you want to ask yourself a question or a set of questions. So it goes to the why bit, the explanation bit of the goals of psychology. So why is this child or this student not doing well in this particular subject? Are they doing well in other subjects? Which subjects are those? So you are asking yourself questions and you form your hypothesis. And a hypothesis is a tentative statement you are making, a prediction that if at the end of the day, this is what I expect to find. I expect to find that the main reason why this boy is not doing well in school is because of so and so. It's because they have a lower, level of IQ, or they have a difficulty with how to learn, or they are not learning well. So you come up with some hypothesis, some possible explanations. So your hypotheses are possible explanations that could be sustaining the problem you have identified, as well as some outcomes you expect by the end of the day. Then the third step is to test the hypothesis through data collection. So you want to collect data, whether from the quantitative or qualitative approaches. And we'll do a lesson under research methods on that. But you want to collect data. Do you want to do a survey? Do you want to do an interview the person? So if you are using a qualitative approach, you use an interview approach, ask them open-ended questions, ask about their experience, how they learn, and all that. Or you may want to just give them a questionnaire on study habits. And all these are just ways of gathering your data. If it's a group of people, a community, you can do that as well. Do a survey or another form of data collection procedure can be used. Then once that is done, you move to the fourth step, which is to examine the evidence that you have from the data collected. What is the evidence telling you? What are the scores that you have gotten from the survey? So maybe 70% of them reported so and so, 30% reported this. So the evidence from the data, what does it say? And then you draw your conclusions based on the evidence from the data collected. And then you move to the fifth step, which is to communicate your findings. So you need to share. And that is what science is all about, so that others will know what you have found, how you found it, and they can also try and see whether it is true or not by replicating your findings. And you do that through your articles you publish or oral presentations. Share the information so that others can, test the validity and reliability of whatever you are saying. So those are the five key steps in the scientific method. And that brings us to the end of the methods of knowing. The scientific method is what psychologists follow in understanding human behavior and mental processes. And once again, psychology is a science. It is not just mind reading and just trying to make certain conclusions based on what the psychologist feels or what they think is happening. This brings us to the end of today's lesson, and I hope it has been helpful, it's been fruitful. Um, this is our first lesson, and I believe as we go on, we'll have a good time. And to review our lesson objectives again, we sought to provide an overview of psychology, what psychology is, and we did that by looking at the definitions of psychology, what psychology is, and what psychology is not. We outlined the goals of psychology. We discussed the practice of psychology as a science, and we also discussed the various methods of acquiring knowledge and how, at the end of the day, psychology follows the scientific method as a way of acquiring knowledge. Thank you once again for joining. If you found this lesson helpful, kindly subscribe to the channel and also like and share to support the growth of this journey. Thank you, and always stay positive.